Coffee.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I hope you had an excellent evening in Washington, had a lot of fun, and are well rested for this morning's activities. I'm the head of content for Broad Group, Capacity Media, and ITW. And just before we get started on this session this morning, I wanted to give you a bit of information about an upcoming event that we have this September. Data Cloud USA is a brand new event for the US data infrastructure market. On the 14th and 15th September, senior leaders from across data center, cloud, edge, HPC, hyperscale, and regional and international enterprise will gather in Austin for 2 days of networking and thought leadership. Core trends across the event will include investment, ESG, the convergence of the infra market, and more. Myself and my Broad Group colleague Chris Thompson are actually going to be here for today and tomorrow. If you do have any questions about the event, I'd love to see many of you there. Nancy will actually be speaking on our program as well, which is excellent. So if you ever got any questions at all, just feel free to come and speak to me. So on to this morning's session. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Converge Business, who are sponsoring the terrestrial connectivity track, as well as AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, STC Global, and Telefonica Global Solutions, as well as all of our partners for this year's ITW. This session is entitled, How are Data Centers Planning for Competing Demands of ESG and Capacity? And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Matt Stansbury from Uptime Institute.
Hello, everyone. Good to meet everyone, and really excited about this distinguished panel here. I'd like just to have everybody do a quick introduction on kind of who you are and what's your role in ESG before we get started. We can start here with Mr. Watko.
I thought we were starting at the other end, but that's all right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Watko. I'm the head of the innovation team for products in U.S. Tower specifically. And we really focus at how we take new technologies into new markets beyond towers and leveraging our experience in towers. And specific to this topic today is we are very active in ESG. We've started programs in the past related to towers, so we've learned a lot from our global footprint of towers and how to do renewable energy, solar, generator, diesel programs, which we can talk throughout the day. So we're very focused already as a corporation from American Tower, and they flow down through the innovation team. And then the other initiative which we've been focusing on that's very related to that, we'll talk more respective to data centers, is the edge data centers. More and more we're continuing to see synergies between towers and edge data centers and how we can not only bring the technology and a digital platform together, but also when it comes to ESG or renewables or other alternative power and energy sources, is you do get a better synergy there when you have multiple asset classes on a single piece of real estate, which we'll talk about the benefits there. And I run that through innovation as well.
Hi, I'm Nancy Novak. I'm Chief Innovation Officer for Compass Data Centers. Really glad Eric brought up Edge because that is one of the topics I'm passionate about when it comes to closing the gap on the digital divide. But ESG is so great. ESG, I'm a builder by nature. I've been, in the construction industry, and being in data centers and being a part of like the fourth industrial revolution of the evolution of humans is fantastic. And ESG is one of those things that is voluminous, many, many layers deep, and exciting because it's going to make all the businesses that we build for better. So I'm super excited to be a part of this panel.
Good morning. So, is this working? Alan Smart, Director of Solution Engineering for Digital Realty. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective than the rest of my panelists. I'm working with customers every day trying to develop solutions that are going to meet their needs. And working with some of our largest clients at Digital Realty, they're pushing us to be better. They're demanding things like renewables and the carbon neutral targets that everybody's demanding. So, we're trying to make sure that we plan for that future and execute on all of those commitments that we've made throughout the industry.
Good morning. Jim Poole. I'm a Vice President for Business Development at Equinix. And on the ESG topic in particular, I guess I have sort of three functions within the company where I contribute. One is network strategy. So I work with the network sales team and the operations and engineering teams to sort of represent the needs of those customers. We obviously are part of their supply chain, and so we have to make assertions as to what we are doing, and so I represent that. Secondly, like several other people, I'm leading a project called Evolving Edge, which is really about how do we scale down as opposed to scale up from, people are used to the multi-megawatt thing. Now we're talking, 500 kVA, so that's the other direction. And the third thing is I'm actually a co-leader internally, so when people talk about ESG, they talk about E a lot. Then you hear less about S, and you hear almost nothing about G. On the S side, on the social side, one of the things we do are employee connection networks, which represent certain subgroupings of people within the company, and so I lead one of the groupings for neurodiverse employees within the company.
Fantastic.
Good morning, I'm Tim Parker, so I'm with Flex Central. I'm the SVP of Network Strategy. I'm part of our ESG committee. We actually built a governance board and a committee that's a diverse committee of folks from HR so that we can cover the social and we can cover the governance with our actual, some legal team and some others. And we're really putting a big initiative this year and focus on that. We're hiring folks to actually build that total platform out so that we can focus on really everything from sustainability to the governance side, as we talked about. We are involved in Edge with Eric and team out there, but we look at the whole process around there as being really core to our business now. We decided it's, customers want it. We owe it back to our communities to kind of work through this and to reduce our impact on, everything from water usage to power, so it's important to us. And then I also represent us on the iMasons advisory board for ESG.
Awesome. I should mention here at Uptime Institute, where I am VP of North America, our role is industry advisor, assessor, and we have invested heavily in the sustainability part of our business. So we have now in-depth training around sustainability reporting for data center operations and executive folks. So let's start with some questions, and we can kind of go through down the line. Sorry, Eric, I promised I'd start on the other side, but you're right here. Let's talk a little bit about, so these are competing demands, right? Capacity and sustainability are competing, like that to some extent. You have to accept that as a truth. What are folks asking you for today? Your big clients in the metaverse. What level of granularity are folks looking for to be assured that you as their supplier are in compliance with their requests?
So this is where it gets really interesting, because being a tower co initially and now getting into the data center business is that we've seen it from globally, especially outside the US, from the MNOs, mobile network operators. It is a big demand. They're very conscientious, and when you go to certain other continents and countries where the grid maybe is not as stable and you got to find other alternative sources than maybe what you get from the power company, and you got to start looking into diesel, or if you go to other parts and how do batteries fit into it and renewables, is we've had to make huge investments over the past years in new technologies. And it is at the forefront of the mobile network operators, not only from an ESG perspective, but just from a pure, how do you keep our network up and running in some of these remote areas when it comes related to towers. And then more and more it's become, how do you do what's right from a corporate citizen of maintaining that service in a proper way, getting to the ESG. And we've been very vocal, as we alluded to over the past years. You go to our website, we have a lot of initiatives that Tom, our CEO, promotes heavily from the tower side. And so we've learned it, we hear it from the mobile network operators, and then as we've gotten into the data center business, we see and hear the same demands from the cloud service providers, the other new customers that we weren't core to our business. And so we felt we were very synergistic in that way. It is driving, it's been very positive in what we're doing. And that's where we've started to say, all right, what we've learned from towers and distributed real estate, and now that we're in the data center business and we're learning from how this world operates in the high capacity, high demands, is how do we bring the synergies of those two worlds together? And we've been actively doing that, and that's where we see, as we've talked about the Edge, which has a lot of layers to it, is one of the benefits you do get from it is, one, you can distribute workloads, so does that theoretically start to distribute the need for high capacity centers? You're still going to need regional metro data centers and core data centers, but at the edge, you start to distribute and take that workload off. But also too is like if we're already doing renewable power and other energy sources at the tower site, how do we leverage that for the edge data centers that we're bringing online? And we're combining that world, and we're working with our supply chain. But we do hear from the customer is, yeah, it's got to be top of mind. It's a requirement they put in, and we're trying to work actively to always meet it and find a new way to do it. Hence why it's driven through the innovation team, is to stay at the leading edge of those conversations and technologies.
Yeah, so just to layer on, and the edge is, the edge is going to be many times bigger than the cloud, but still need the cloud, right? So the density and the capacity that we're hearing about is, having to, figure out how to do more with less, and also just more sustainable. So I've spent like the last year and a half looking at everything from on-prem nuclear to, fuel cells to microgrids to battery energy storage. We just joined as an anchor members at Compass with the long duration energy storage initiative with McKinsey, which I think is fascinating, and I've never seen so many smart people in my life working on a problem. And what I love about it is, it is very, very critical that the other 5 billion people who don't have access get access to try to make sure the internet is the great equalizer and not the great divider, right? Opportunity is all about having that access, that reliable access, and we need to be smarter about how we use our resources. So I truly believe that this is kind of forcing us to do that, and it's a good thing.
Yeah, so our customers are demanding that we be carbon neutral. I mean, that's that's the bottom line. I've been in this industry a long time. 25, 26 years ago, everybody was freaking out because we were deploying a 2 kilowatt cabinet at May East. How are we going to possibly provide the power and cool that? And now I've got a client that's just the other day talking about a 600 kilowatt deployment with 45 kilowatt cabinets. It's just a little different. So the question is, how do you, and power density is not going down. The power requirements for the industry are not going down. So how do you effectively and efficiently drive that power and cooling, right, to meet all those carbon neutral targets? That's what we're looking at. So it's choosing the right technologies for cooling. It's being smart about where you source the power, right? So at Digital we've got over 600 megawatts of renewable power in our portfolio. 100% of our European customers have renewable energy that we supply, and our global co-location customers get supplied with renewable energy as well. So that's 50% of our global portfolio. So we're trying to be smart about obviously driving and promoting that industry to make sure that that renewables are in our future. It's also designing with technologies for cooling specifically that use the resources effectively. Getting a water out of the cooling design, so you're not using that as a utility and a resource is very important in a lot of areas, right? So split DX refrigeration-based cooling is pretty important. But quite honestly, other areas, Ireland comes to mind. It's cold and rainy there a lot, and so adiabatic chillers actually work quite well. So it's being smart about the deployment of technologies and using that. Regarding some of the tertiary and secondary markets, building out the edge, I think the key for us is let's come up with a design that we're satisfied with, we know works, and then let's replicate that to other markets, and that's our strategy basically.
Yeah. So I guess it starts sort of per my earlier remarks with our customers, right? So we see that whether it's Google, Microsoft, Workday, we have any number of customers who want us to report to them, how are we doing according to the goals that we've set out. And so in pursuit of that, we have a whole raft, I guess you would say. In fact, actually, I'll give a little plug. This actually got released last week. So this is a 23-page sustainability report that we publish every year. And this is how we report back to our customers on our progress. So we track things like how much renewable energy do we use. So for the last 5 years, we've been slowly creeping upward. We're at 95% today with the goal of being 100% by 2030 since we joined the EU Data Center Pact for renewable energy. But we also track things like Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. We track energy efficiency. We also track carbon intensity. right? So, and then downstream, if you think about, going in the other direction, kind of what you were saying, is it has to do with, well, how do you actually build, design, and operate the facilities, right? So, and we do any number of really interesting things. So if you were actually to go to one of our facilities in Amsterdam, we take the waste heat from the data center, we ship it to the university next door. We have a new facility we just commissioned in Munich where we're doing something similar. We take the waste heat, we put it into a thermal aquifer in the ground, and then third parties can actually tap that heat in the wintertime to heat their buildings. So, and these are the concerns driven by the locals. Requirements. So that's specifically in Munich, that's what they want to see. So many times you're actually not just dealing with, what your big global customers want, but what does the local community actually require of you? And so you have to take that in consideration. Probably people are familiar with, recently there was a power moratorium in Singapore, that they were concerned about how much power is being consumed in the industry. And so one of the things you do to make sure when the moratorium is over and you can get power, and we had to do this a lot, was to actually take all of this information and sit down with the Singaporean government and say, hey, when power does become available, here's why you would want us to be consuming that power versus, say, anybody else. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot of the same things. I think Jim and Alan hit on it a little bit with the customers. I mean, one of the nice parts is a lot of those large enterprise, high-tech type of customers have innovation offices with these same type of goals. And they're coming to us and saying, let's collaborate on a way to use our 30 kW racks, but do something different with the heat, or do something different with the way that we cool those so that it's more sustainable and that we can manage that going down the path. I love the ideas of reusing the heat. We've been talking with a couple of big customers who are like, let's just take that heat and do some of the similar things. And so it's a collaboration between us and the customers, and it has to be that way because we can only control the data center so much. We can't always control the gear that they're putting in there. And so if they're working to make their gear more sustainable or lower heat or do some stuff around there, then it helps us be able to manage those critical resources. One thing that we have an initiative that we decided is we're going to be a WE water usage of 0 across our data centers going forward. We have some data centers in areas where droughts, Colorado, we run into droughts all the time. We want to make sure that's a precious resource in the environment out there. And so if we can get away from using that as much as possible, we want to go down that path. Get away from fossil fuels. We have an initiative to make sure that we're moving away from fossil fuels as we go through there and working with a couple different folks. And again, back to the same thing, whether it's your partners that are helping you build the data centers or it's your customers, everyone now, especially the larger enterprises, have some initiatives to do that. And so it's really great. And so, why we built the committee was what we did is so that now we can go out to our customers, like our customer advisory councils and stuff, and start getting inputs from them, so we can, kind of marry our initiatives together to our targets because we're not going to be able to do it alone. And I was talking to Jim prior to this, and I think iMasons, we're pushing it at iMasons a lot, but Nancy knows this, and the industry together has to come together and put some standards in place that can kind of help us get there. And so that we're kind of collaborating and not just competing, because in the end, it's the generations after us that we're trying to save the world for.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So we've got a question, and it's also aligned with a question I'd like to ask a bit. So how are you setting your achievable, quantifiable ESG targets and reporting on them? And I think this is a question generally. We heard Jim kind of show his paperwork there. What level of maturity and specificity are your clients looking at as far as reporting? I mean, it feels like it's been a sea change, at least from my perspective, in the last 2 years as to what's been requested and what people are interested in, how they're even staffing or approaching this as an issue that is more mature and has more processes and things in place. Where are y'all at with kind of maturity and reporting at this point? And how has that changed?
Well, I'll start the reporting. We're privately held, so we don't necessarily report publicly on a lot of our stuff that we do. But I think the maturity level is very, very deep right now when it comes to what is expected. And I think that we're just like we were just talking about in iMasons, we're trying to figure out the best way to measure so that it's apples for apples and it's not greenwashing and things like that. But honestly, things like product declarations and material assessments and science-based targets and things that are more scope 3-ish rather than just focusing on consumption. Consumption's big, but being able to to make concrete more sustainable, I'll give you an example, just as an example. When you think about the built environment, so 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world is from the built environment. 29% of that's, operating buildings, maintaining buildings, upgrading buildings, and 11% is building it, right? And data centers, the big builds on data centers are, only like 10 to 15 years old. So we're kind of new. Data centers are kind of new in this, global expansion of building. So we really have to look at that 11% that's from the built and, the building structure itself, and try to get better at, being more sustainable. So as an example, if you have a large campus, you can put a batch plant on campus. Now you don't have ready-mix trucks going back and forth. That is part of the Scope 3, assessment. And you can fine-tune your mix designs and make them so instead of just saying a 6-stack mix, I need this much strength in this many days, you fine-tune it, you have control over it, and you can cut out. I think we've reduced 20% just on fine-tuning our mix designs, and then added carbon cure, so where you can inject, carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it into our concrete. So we're trying to layer on these ways of making our products more sustainable. And then when you look at a concrete structure, cement is, somewhere in that 7% of the global footprint, greenhouse gas, but it's also the most used material in the world. It doesn't burn, it's reliable, it takes, it lasts a long time. And then thermally, its thermodynamics are there, right? So from an HVAC standpoint, it has those kind of properties that enhance it. So you look at these things holistically. I feel like if we really focus on the built environment, we're going to have some big strides towards getting better on, making that global greenhouse gas footprint much smaller than it is right now.
So I'll go next. So this is a great example of the G part, right? Of, how do you actually measure, report, and be transparent about what you're up to. So, what we did to show the level of commitment to be able to be as specific as we are is we created first a sustainability program office. So there's a dedicated director who oversees a team of 30. Those 30 people are embedded in the business lines internally, so operations, design and construction, and they are given goals, right? According to what we are reporting, 10 pages of that report is just GRI reporting items, right? And then to make sure we're holding ourselves to those things, the incentives all the way down to the executive level. So everyone within Equinix, VP and up, we have ESG goals that affect our stock grants. So if you want to make sure that you're actually doing what you say you will do, you pay for it. That's the easiest way to do it, right? And then externally, sort of in the other direction, is in addition to GRI, there's 11 public frameworks that we subscribe to as far as how we report out, and against many of those frameworks there's grades, right? And so, for example, we're on the EPA top 100 for green. We get an A- from the CDP for our efforts against those things. So it's a combination, I think, of what do you do internally from a controls and policy perspective to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do, and then also making sure that you are extraordinarily transparent in how you report that out, because then you're holding yourself accountable externally as well.
I'll jump right in. We did a securitization at the beginning of the year, and a large portion of that was green bonds. And so that means we've got to go through and have all these programs in place and report those back. So we're in the process of reporting every quarter to the board where we're at, how we're meeting our goals, the process to achieve that. We're not public, so we don't have to go out there and do that, but we're open to sharing whatever we have. We know that it's just part of the, being a good, part of the community, but at the same time, it's really important to us, and we did the same thing. We're hiring people to be part of the, peer ESG program. We're actually going out and hiring, analysts and folks to work with us so that we have all this in place, because there is a financial impact to it also, and you kind of got to measure the two, but it's we just see it as back to the same thing as table stakes, just like PUE was.
I'm assuming you guys have heard of green bonds, right? Everybody? I was just curious, because that is a big, I think getting the financial institutions into this is really helpful, because it's bottom line stuff, right? Yep. So really motivates you.
So at Digital Realty, we also have a sustainability group that is monitoring all of that data and reporting it out through an ESG report on our website. You can go look at that every year. We do that, obviously, for our customer base. We do that for our shareholders that are driving us to be better every year. And you know, as far as green bonds, we've got $6 billion in green bonds for doing, you know, these type of projects to make sure that, you know, we're having a sustainable initiative going forward.
And I'll just add, from American Tower's perspective, it's very mature. Again, going back to our tower heritage, is that we have 200,000 towers globally. And so we're already been in these markets. We've already had to adhere to the regulations and already start the trends and measure it. And in Africa, for example, we're one of the largest consumers of diesel fuel because it goes back to that grid of how you're going to support towers. And applying what we learned there, we measured, and we have a diesel reduction usage program in place that we measure what's going on there. And then jointly with that, we built a program around how to measure the amount of assisted towers from solar. So we put these programs in place, we monitor them, and that's where we're taking those lessons learned from there and applying them to what CoreSite does in our data center business, and now finding common grounds how we report on both of them. And there is a lot of synergies, and they do come together nicely from our perspective, because it is large, huge facilities, and then it's 200,000 distributed sites. And how do you measure those comfortably and confidently is it starts at the top. And we, just like everyone else mentioned here, we have very similar structures and organizations focused at this, and that we get measured not only on a global basis, but within each region and each country, we measure it, track it.
That's great. So I think this is a really good question to transition to. What's not being done that needs to be done for sustainability, for developing digital infrastructure capacity? What's the kind of low-hanging fruit that isn't being tapped right now? And maybe you are doing it yourself, but largely don't see the rest of the industry looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I can, you know, sort of jump in first. I guess, you know, I think, and this is really to your point, because I think this is an excellent point, you know, obviously, you know, some of the bigger companies, as we've heard, have, you know, invested a lot more. But other companies in the industry are sort of earlier in their ability to do this. And we really do need to promote sort of cross-industry standards. And then hold ourselves accountable as an industry. Right now, it's sort of, you know, I have one program and he has another program and he has a third program, and we all feel really good about ourselves. But, you know, objectively, you know, what's the impact across the entire industry? So to me, it's really about, you know, sort of external coordination as an industry. I think we would benefit all together from doing that. So.
Yeah, I think the iMason climate accord that you talked about earlier is a right step in the direction for that.
Yeah, I agree, because like when you think about technologies, and there's another question here about just startups. I mean, there's so many great ideas out there, but to make them not cost prohibitive and to be able to like do it, you have to kind of have some scale, and you have to coordinate. And so like I like the iMason's climate accord agreement, because it's having like the biggest names in data center construction kind of coordinate how we want to measure things and what we want to prioritize, so that we still get the reliability, we still get, you know, what we need from a redundancy standpoint, and we still get the capacity we need to continue to, you know, support all these technologies that are coming on board.
Yeah. As a society, I think the biggest challenge that we have, though, is energy storage. You know, we can produce the energy, right, with renewables. The problem is how do you store it effectively and then reuse it, right? And you know, I know Elon's working on battery farms and things like that, but we're just not there yet. I think whoever solves that really solves the problem.
You know, I think the one thing when we talk about what have we not done, I don't think, back to what Jim was talking about and what I said earlier, I don't think we've come up with good solid programs and frameworks for it. Everybody's kind of going at it on their own. Everybody's kind of building it. I think there was an IDC report that came out maybe a month ago or so that said only about 40% of companies, large enterprises, really have a sustainability program. The others are still forming it. And so if we can get ahead of that a little bit and kind of put, here's the best practices, then we can probably all follow at least a consistent guideline so that we're, you know, doing something similar. Otherwise, it will be all over the board.
Let me ask a quick question. I think each of you comes from innovation background, and you're embedded in your organization in a way that's really technical and exciting. What's the game changer, you think, for sustainability? And I think you hit on it a little bit with the energy storage. I want to kind of like dive into that a little bit. What are the game-changing adaptations, technologies, or ideas that are coming out that are just going to change things for y'all?
Yeah. I can start because it kind of touches on the other question about the startups and whatever. So there's sort of a convergence there. But so one of the things we did was we started a program internally called Data Center of the Future. And as part of that, right here, actually, in the Washington market, we have what we call a co-innovation facility. And so that's how new startup technologies can come to us, but then we can also look at the opportunities to do really game-changing types of investments. So, just to give you a couple of examples, one would be fuel cells, right? So if we're, sort of familiar with the energy efficiency of, say, a car, right? That's 20%, right? The best oil, diesel, coal-burning plant, that'll get you to, 40%. However, fuel cells potentially can take you all the way up to 60% energy efficiency, and the byproduct is water, right? Which is a lovely thing. It also has the advantage, to your point, that I think is good. That is, it has a direct tie into how the renewable industry works overall, right? So we all are familiar with things like solar and wind, and one of the problems that people always point to is the fact that, well, what happens when it's not windy, or what happens when it's not sunny? Well, part of what you can do is you can make sure that you use that green energy to go ahead and create the hydrogen that you need to power the fuel cells, and so you get portability of energy through that process. So that's an example of how you can innovate your way to becoming more energy efficient and less greenhouse gas.
I like the second question here about getting the suppliers and vendors, to join in. Anyway, there are some crazy, making energy out of rust and compressed air storage energy, and there's all kinds of amazing technologies that are starting to go through this proving process. Again, it's how to scale and how to normalize it to where we can trust it and it can, be in a mission critical environment. Those are but I feel like as owners, we can definitely request and demand of our suppliers to meet certain goals. And I think really focusing on the performance and the outcome versus, restricting them to a certain, specification, I think is important to say, this is the outcome I need. I mean, we do that with concrete, right? I need this kind of an outcome, and it has to meet these sustainable goals. You can do that with all kinds of products as well, and equipment. And looking, down our supply chain and our big vendors, we want to know what their Scope 3 emissions are so that we can report that out as well. So, really trying to dig into how to put those numbers together, I think is important.
Yeah, and then to just continue on that, because what we've seen with the suppliers and vendors is the other question is how do we get engaged with you is from a global perspective, our CTO, Ed Knapp, he leads our innovation programs across the board. We meet on a regular basis. We have then what we call vertical leads for each of the initiatives. I own the Edge Data Center and Innovation. I have a peer of mine who leads it for alternative power and energy and ESG programs like that. So we have ways to get in. We hold quarterly kind of work groups where we share ideas. We bring vendors in that are promoting new concepts, new ideas. So feel free you always can reach out to Ed. He's very engaging and so forth like that. But also in each region, there's an innovation team. So Africa, Europe, LATAM, India. And if you do searches on their regional sites, you'll find those innovation leaders. Engage with them, and they'll help push you or point you in the right direction of how to work with American Tower, how to get into some of our innovation initiatives. Can they participate? Is there proof of concepts or kind of activities that we might be doing at a smaller scale before we take it at full scale? But that's how we do it with our vendors and suppliers, because they are critical. It's not going to be done by us. We really need a larger ecosystem and partner group. So feel free to reach out to us individually or as an organization, and we'll evaluate it and figure out how to roll it into some of our programs we got going forward.
As far as technology innovation, we work with our strategic suppliers and to really try and drive those thoughts that are going to achieve the targets that we need to achieve. It's challenging, but one of the things we're looking at is submersible cooling, right? Basically you're eliminating the need for cooling systems altogether, other than a dielectric fluid. Basically taking the server card, putting it in a bath. So. I think that's still a ways off, but that actually has some promise for future development and possibly driving the efficiencies tremendously.
So I was going to bring up when we talk about game changers, I think it's really the focus around AI and using IoT sensors and starting to take all that data and using science to actually help us drive this is going to be critical. Almost every piece of equipment that we put in data centers has some type of sensor or something that we can gather data from, and there's no reason we can't start to do that on measuring how we're using our energy or the carbon footprints or anything like that. We have the tools. We just got to get people together to say these are the standards. Nancy, when we were in Seattle, we talked about how PUE just kind of became an industry standard ad hoc. It was just, people started using that term, and the next thing you know, everybody measures it. And there's no reason why we can't do the same thing. But we can use science to do it with, AI and IoT and all of those tools that are out there. And then, take those analytics and then report on them and then figure out how do we work together to get to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. And then we can get predictive on it. We can continuously improve, and can't improve what you can't measure kind of thing. So yeah, we have the technology. We just need to implement it. So I agree. And I did see a question about iMasons being U.S. centric. There is, Simon Allen is the head of the European iMasons, and they're very strong in Europe. So I want to make sure you guys know that there's a huge presence there.
Awesome. All of you have fairly advanced ideas around the edge and are involved in the edge. And I think, Nancy, one of the things that you said is the edge is going to be bigger than the cloud. What I see when I talk to Uptime Institute's clients who are large data center owners, operators, the edge, we think about the edge, we think about new technologies being kind of shiny, clean, Apple AirPods. The edge is dirty. The edge is put in somebody's basement. It's it's the compute that's stuck in a milk bottling plant that's run by a team of people you've never met. What is the edge's impact going to be on ESG? Because it seems unmanageable, right? The smaller workloads, you don't have as much control over them as a owner of edge assets, and the governance of the edge is really, really immature. And so, from my view, the edge is pretty dirty. How do you categorize that? And I mean dirty in an operating sense, in a management sense, right? You're constantly accepting exceptions to your policies. I mean, because you're a small player in a bigger ecosystem, even if your name's Microsoft or So, I'd just be curious, kind of, what's your edge impact on ESG going to look like?
I mean, I think it depends, because the edge is, the definition of this is very broad, very, very broad. And it's all about how to support the technology coming forward when everything has a chip and, reducing latency and things like that. But when you look at the areas that aren't going to have, subsea cable access, and they're not going to have hard fiber, they're going to be bouncing signals off satellites, and then, getting into these remote locations where you have battery energy storage as the only source of power. So that's actually clean, in a lot of regards. And it's, it just depends on what type of edge you're talking about. But my hope is that we end up, being able to provide access in a meaningful way to the areas that aren't going to have that hard infrastructure, right?
And I would say, when you're saying it's ugly, I think there's two aspects of it. We view it as there's the user edge, which is where you're talking about, is the user edge is still very immature and trying to figure out how you manage that, who's managing it, who's responsible for all those edge devices. But there's also the service provider edge, which is what I think Nancy's alluding to. And the service provider edge, there's a couple layers to it, as we've discovered, right? There's some people say the metro edge, some people, we'll call it the tower edge, is the edge. And I think we're getting some good frameworks around how we can control that. I think it is becoming more consistent of how you measure ESG, what kind of initiatives and programs you can do to there. There is demand and capacity. There are benefits you can get from the service provider edge, and it's going to be driven from the customers, as we alluded to earlier. But at the far edge, the user edge, there's a lot of just people trying to figure out what does that look like and how do they tie it together to that service provider edge, and do the service providers really want to own it? Because that then means they're then responsible for a lot of those programs, which then will flow back to all of us sitting here, of how we then support that and how either up the stack you want to go in some cases, or how far out to the edge you want to go from a physical infrastructure perspective.
I think one of the things we have to remember is, as you talked about the consumer edge or the user edge, those are high-tech type of things that are being built, and they all have initiatives too. So if we can figure out how to work together and make sure that their initiatives tie into ours, and then when we move into that, we call it local edge, but we've been working with the ATC guys for a while and how to make that. But I think that it's really back to what I was saying before. It's the tech companies are going to drive a lot of it, and we have to be there to drive the infrastructure that supports them to be really sustainable too. And so it's going to be a combination. We can't control what somebody does with their cell phone or what they want to do with it, but the folks that are manufacturing it can definitely make those, the batteries and stuff in there much more efficient, much more, sustainable, long-term. We've got the capabilities. Again, it comes down to sometimes where I was going to go with that, it comes down to the economics of it. So until we as a society go ahead and make that a focus versus just performance, we're always going to see a little bit of a back and forth on what we want to do. Yeah. But we've got to make it it's got to be forefront in our designs going forward.
And actually, I'll riff off of that. So in the idea of sort of practice what you preach, right? There are edge scenarios that happen today, as well as the ones we expect sort of in the wireless space. And so one of the things that we have done is we, as part of that data center of the future effort, we created a scaled down data center. So, and the way we went about it was, and internally, this is the world's worst marketing name, so Mariska, do not get upset with me. We call it a brick-based data center, right? And so we have variability to the number of data halls, so we can go from 250 to 500 kVA. I can affect the width of those data halls or the length of those data halls, depending on what the intensity of the equipment that sits inside. So for example, if you're going to do a cable landing station where the only thing is networking equipment, then they want full walk-around rack access, and the power densities are 4 kVA and under, right? So I can add more racks just by extending the width. And so we've done that in places like Genoa, Italy. We just launched a facility in Bordeaux, France, all using those technologies. We've even taken things that we've learned in our larger facilities, like how to move cool air on positive pressure through a facility, and we actually scaled that down and incorporated it into the modular design. So it's not something that's down the road and maybe it will happen someday. It's actually happening now, and people are doing things to go ahead and address edge requirements.
Awesome. Let's talk a little, I'd love to hear from kind of each of you what your gap is that you're trying to address. What's the challenge? Is it staffing these programs, funding these programs? Is it kind of driving consistency? That seems to be kind of a recurring issue, right? Driving consistency. But what's the gap that each of you is trying to address?
I think I have a lot of gaps, but I do think that the initial outlay, on the CapEx is something that we're trying to figure out. And I see the question here about how hard it is to get funding for ESG focused initiatives. And honestly, it's all about the pro forma and return on investment and what you can and cannot do. When it comes to consumption and technology, swapping out like a tier 2 generator is expensive, right? So when you multiply that times 36 generators for one building, that's a lot of money. But if you can, get your clients to agree on a demand response kind of initiative where they get a ROI, and there's ways in which you can, recover that money over the next 8 to 10 years, then it makes it more feasible. But you have to kind of really get that buy-in, in a very holistic partnership. A lot of the other ESG focused initiatives from the built environment are not that hard, because you have these technologies they're saying if you have scale, we can offer technology. For very reasonable, or in many cases, for no additional cost. We'll set up, but if you're going to place, 200,000 yards of concrete, our setup's free, right? And we can go to town. So it does depend, but I do think that it takes the whole team. Everyone with a vested interest has to kind of be able to weigh in to look at how to lay out that money initially, make it affordable, scale it, and then get that performer to work so you can still compete.
So, I'll give you what starts sounding like a non-data center starting point, but the thing that I sort of stay up at night and worry about is, what's the use case, right? So in my previous comment, I was talking about, okay, we can design and deploy edge data centers. That's fantastic. But as an industry, and I'm sure Eric will appreciate this as well, if you were to ask me what's the use case for 5G that will promote sub 10 millisecond requirements that would then cause guys like Eric and everybody else up here to start building more smaller facilities, I don't think we know. And I don't think the operators know either. And so we're sort of, both working together to try to figure out, what's the actual answer to that problem. And it's not an easy answer. Actually, solving the technology side of how do you build it was the easy part. Right? Figuring out, okay, what does 5G standalone actually mean in practice, and how long is it going to take, and how is it going to affect the infrastructure at a national level? That still to be determined.
Point, yeah. Use case, it's a very good point.
And then it's how you monetize that, right? I think some people are starting to get ideas on the use cases. It's how do they make money? Who's making the money? So when you ask, like, what's the gaps are filling, that's kind of, again, our role within the innovation is to figure out not only the technology, because I agree with Jim, you can solve the technology problem and you can scale it and put money towards it and spend capital and deploy these things, but until you really understand the use case and really who's going to consume it and how they're going to pay for it, whatever that may be. It was funny, I was on the way here in the Uber, the gentleman was asking me, the driver, about is my carrier service for whoever his wireless carrier going to start to go down? And I told him, I'm like, yeah, 5G is interesting. 5G is promising all these great use cases, but it's going to come at a cost. And as the networks, going back to what Jim was saying, is like someone's going to have to pay for the deployment of all these new technologies and these new apps, these new networks, which all relate to a lot of the ESG, because you are going to see a lot more distributed network, and it's going to drive some of those things. So the gap we try to figure out is like, great, we can scale, but also what's to the use cases is how do we monetize it, or who's monetizing it, and can they do it in what time frames?
So, I'm a networking guy by trade, so I do like the whole idea of monetizing the network. Pandemic was great times for us in the network world because you guys finally realized we're just as critical as power, and you needed us. But the key around a lot of that, which now is a tough time with material shortages and things too. So you're having to make adjustments on what you thought would be even a more efficient system, but you still have to manage capacity and demand. And so you kind of have to shift, and I think that's a big challenge for us right now. We can't stop building data centers when the demand is exceeding the capacity that we have. So we have to try to get in front of that. And then what do you do with older assets that you need to go back and retrofit? Older assets that aren't as efficient, but you've put these corporate goals out there to get certain PUEs or water things down, but now you have assets that, the retrofit, as Nancy pointed out, I mean, some of that stuff can be not only extremely costly, but can you really afford the downtime to do it, or migrating customers so that you can support doing that? And that's where I think the challenge is, and you have to balance it. From a corporate standpoint, I don't think there's, in most of a corporate America, I don't think you're going to have a board out there that's going to say don't do ESG. Everybody's bought into it, but how you deploy it and then monetize those features. And I'll go back to the sensor and the AI data. I think if we can figure out how to measure that properly and use that data, while you may not be able to monetize that directly, you can use that to monetize your assets that people want to build into.
Excellent. So a quick question around, I think this last comment I just saw really hits on kind of the heart of it, is resiliency in ESG. Is it a trade-off? And maybe it's not even a one-to-one trade-off between the two. You put cost in there and time to build, and you start, here's your 4 goals, pick 3 you want. What is the trade-off from your standpoint on resiliency and sustainability?
I could jump in first, I guess. And this is, sorry, a little bit of a retread of an answer, but I'll go back to, sort of the smaller data centers and, how you configure, how you do the power for it, right? So, most people don't appreciate the fact that the gas grid in the United States is, more reliable than the power grid, right? And if you stop putting gas into it today and used it at the current rate you're using it, it would still last for 6 months. So you can take natural gas, use fuel cells. By using fuel cells, you're doing DC power directly into the data center. I can take away the UPS. So I actually get both ESG benefits and, the ability to actually, so it's a positive feedback loop that you're trying to create. And there's any number, I think, of those level of opportunities in terms of, how you can be efficient. Another thing we've done, we were working with Intel. Everybody always jokes software is eating the world, right? Well, we work on something called software-defined power, right? So what if you could get the power infrastructure in the data center to respond to the load on the CPU on the server, right? Most of the equipment you plug in, you turn it on, and it runs at whatever it runs at all the time, never changes, right? So you can actually impact that as well. So, to us, I don't think it's a trade-off. It's more about just being very thoughtful and thorough about how you do your build and design.
Yeah, I mean, and some of it's just like if it's new and not tried and true, it's hard to want to bank on it. But I do agree. I think a lot of initially, I feel like when we really get into swapping out some of the fossil fuel type ways of getting energy, it's going to cost us more up front until it's proven. And then when it scales, the price will normalize and then people will get used to it. So I think we're just at that stage right now where we're going to have to start. That's why the green bonds are so important. We can start, putting money into like just moving forward on these technologies that are good and available and just maybe cost a little bit more right now. And then we get those to be reliable so our clients can enjoy those and not be worried about it. And remember too, when it comes to redundancy and data centers, like there's a lot of it, right? So we kind of have to ask ourselves again, how much is too much, right?
I think one of the other things that we've worked with a couple local municipalities where we actually put our generators on the grid. So during an emergency, they have it. The beauty of that is they do the testing for us. So we don't have to, every month they fire them up and test them and make sure that it's there. But working with your local communities you can build that resiliency, but they need the resiliency too. So why don't we figure out ways to share more of our redundancy and resiliency between other organizations that need it? Because we're not, we may have clean power coming in, but there may be another part of the city that's now in trouble and needs some help with, stuff, or a hospital or some of those other critical features. There's no reason to have, everybody have their entire resiliency and generators out there. There is opportunity to share at points.
Interesting concept. So power obviously is a big issue with resiliency. I'd like to throw out a concept that people think about as application layer resiliency. Some of our most sophisticated clients actually have, deployments around the world, and they can shift that workload on their applications wherever the sun's shining, right? So the ability to be able to transfer workloads to where you're generating power, I think that's a potential for a future, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way we all do our hyperscale builds, right? It's not like the hyperscalers want 2N. They don't, because they build for system level redundancy, right? They can lose 1 million square feet. I've actually heard this from one of them. 1 million square feet of compute capacity, and you would never notice.
Never know.
Right?
Yeah.
And the facilities themselves run hotter.
And
like you say, they're not as individually redundant, so we can do it at a system level, not necessarily all the way down to the individual data center.
I mean, even most financial institutions, if the whole eastern seaboard grid goes down, it just switches over to the west. I mean, things like that. So, but not every country has that ability. But yeah, there's a lot of redundancy and resiliency, which are two different things. But yeah, we have to ask ourselves how much is enough, right?
Right.
Excellent. One more question here, and I do think this is an interesting one that I'm seeing from Mariska there. So how are y'all influencing your suppliers and vendors and folks because ultimately you're consuming a lot of technologies, a lot of product, a lot of utility. How are you influencing the folks that are supplying you?
So as part of this report that I was referring to, and like I said, you can look it up, one of the things that we do is we actually have a supplier code of conduct. So the requirements that we put on ourselves, we also insert into our supplier code of conduct. And so we do reviews with our major vendors to make sure that they are in compliance with, what we're being asked to be in compliance over. So absolutely, it flows all the way downstream.
Yeah, we use our governance part of that to just, the same thing, influence the providers, actually, have certain goals also, and then, measure and track and report to us.
Stuff flows downhill.
Our master teaming agreements are all, written around performance-based, goals, including sustainability. And like I said, the major suppliers, they're really into the scope 3 measurement, which is very challenging, but we've figured out a good method on how to get that so that we can have a really good understanding, about how to get better with it.
Excellent. Well, I think we should maybe open it up to the crowd. Anybody who's not on the screen that has a question for the panel. All right. Any closing remarks here? We've got a couple minutes left. What would you all want people to know about this journey towards being more sustainable on digital infrastructure?
I actually was wanting to, because I can't help myself every time I speak, I want to bring up one part of the S is social, the diversity factor. Because I'm in construction and there's not a lot of diversity, I feel like diversity brings innovation, and I really would like for people to kind of be that pebble in the pond where you spread the word that, we definitely need skilled trades. It's hard to put work in place right now. We don't have enough skilled trades to do what we have to do. Money's not keeping our clients from putting work in place. It's literally getting the workers who have the tools to be able to do the work and do it safely and do it correctly, right? So I really wanted to just put a plug in for bringing more diversity into our industry and in tapping the transferable skills that you can find from all genders and cultures.
Yeah, I was going to say that although, like I said, anytime you do an ESG conversation, you spend a lot of time on E, which we did. Got a little bit of G in, that was good. But I definitely think on the social side, so, in addition to all of the other objectives we set for ourselves, we set ourselves hard metrics for gender participation in the business at different levels of the business, all the way up to the board. So, what's the male-female ratios on the board? We do the same thing with race. So we have, objectives that we are trying to achieve, and I would want everybody in our business, just like what we were saying on the technology side, to sort of lean in and adopt the same sort of level of responsibility in terms of how they operate their businesses. So,
yeah, I was going to bring up. I think education's important. We need to educate people on our industry and on what we're trying to accomplish in our industry and how important it is to, the different diversity and social aspects. We are in a position as data center operators to support the infrastructure that's going to get information out to the masses, and we need to just be very active in how we try to support that, but also in promoting, like Nancy was saying, promoting, getting folks. I mean, we talked about this, in the high schools, we don't talk about, I don't know if there's anyone here with high school kids that says, I'm going to go work at a data center company when I get out of high school. So we've got to start thinking, because we are the stewards of a lot of this data, and we've got the capability. We just have to educate folks.
Yeah, my son's actually 19, and I'm trying to push him into that Northern Virginia Community College program for data center industry.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. We just have to figure out how to get out there.
Yeah, and quite honestly, we've come a long way. The data center industry in general has come a long way in 5 or 6 years since we were on the Greenpeace list, right? The dirty dozen. We've come a long way, and I do want my son to join the industry, and I want him to be able to inherit an industry that we can be proud of.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly very proud of what Digital Realty and others have done to make those strides, to make the industry better.
Well, it's a positive point to end. We're over time, so thank you very much. Great panel. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really great session, so thank you for those insights, and it's great to hear about every pillar of ESG. We've got our next session, which is Collaborating at the Edge, which will be starting, in a few moments. So if you want to stick around for that, that's great. We'll be starting in a minute.